There is a small sign on the side of a highway outside Rotterdam. Most drivers pass it at 120 kilometers an hour without noticing it. The sign marks the lowest point in the entire Netherlands, a patch of farmland called the Zuidplaspolder. This spot sits 6.76 meters below sea level. That means there are more than 22 feet of open air between where a person would stand there and where the ocean's surface actually sits, if nothing were holding the water back. About a quarter of the entire country sits below sea level like this. It is not just farmland either. Parts of Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and The Hague all sit below sea level too. These are some of the most crowded cities in Europe, built on ground that should be underwater. Millions of people live entirely normal lives there. They go to work, run businesses, and raise kids on this land every single day. If people stopped taking care of it for even a few years, the water would move back in. This did not happen by luck. It happened because of one of the most determined engineering efforts in human history. Understanding how it works is a genuinely satisfying story about people solving a very hard problem, piece by piece, for hundreds of years. To understand why the Netherlands needs this much engineering, you first need to understand what the ground there is actually made of. Much of the western and northern Netherlands sits on a river delta. A delta is a low, flat, muddy area formed where rivers slow down and drop the sand and mud they are carrying before reaching the sea. Over thousands of years, the Rhine, the Meuse, and the Scheldt rivers built this delta by carrying sediment down from inland and dropping it before flowing into the North Sea. About half the country sits less than 1 meter above sea level. A large part of that land, including the Zuidplaspolder, sits below sea level completely. Researchers studying the country's flood protection have estimated that around 60% of the Netherlands could flood in some way, either from the sea or from the rivers running through it. There is no natural high ground protecting these areas. The only thing standing between the people living there and the water is a system built entirely by humans. Walls called dikes, sandhills called dunes, and pumps and channels that drain water away. A dike works in a simple way. It is a long wall, usually made of packed earth, stone, or concrete, built along a coastline or riverbank. It blocks water from moving inland, the same way a raised edge on a tray keeps water from spilling off the side. Dunes work in a similar way along parts of the coast, except they are natural or reinforced sandhills instead of built walls. Behind these dikes and dunes, much of the land actually needs constant pumping since it sits below the level of the rivers, canals, and sea around it. Rainwater and river water that would normally drain away on their own have to be pumped out instead, or the low areas would slowly fill up like a bathtub with the drain closed. This is not a new problem. The Dutch have been dealing with it for close to 1,000 years. As early as the 1600s, communities used windmills to pump water out of low areas called polders. A polder is a section of land surrounded by dikes, where the water level inside can be controlled and lowered on purpose. Over time, this turned shallow lakes and marshland into farmland people could actually use. One of the earliest large projects, the Beemster Polder, was drained starting in 1612, using only windmill power. The Zuidplaspolder itself, the lowest point in the country today, used to be an actual lake. It was drained between 1825 and 1840, using 30 windmills working together to pump water out into a canal built around it. Projects like these repeated for centuries. Communities kept pushing back the water using wind, gears, and a huge amount of patience. For all that steady progress, the Netherlands has also lost this fight more than 100 times since the year 1200, according to historical records. Some of these floods were very destructive, but nothing in modern history compares to what happened on the night of January 31st, 1953. A powerful windstorm over the North Sea combined with an unusually high tide. Strong wind blowing across open water for a long distance can push huge amounts of water toward the coast. When that happens at the same time as a naturally high tide, the water level can rise far above what the coastline is normally built to handle. Together, the wind and the tide created a wall of water called a storm surge, and it broke through sea defenses across the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, and Belgium at the same time. In the Netherlands alone, the water rose as high as 5.6 meters above its normal level in some places. Most of the country's dikes at the time were not built to handle something that severe, and the warning systems in place failed almost completely. A national flood warning service had existed for decades before this storm, but at the time, it only had about 30 subscribers who received alerts by telegram. Out of the roughly 200 local water boards responsible for the hardest-hit region, only one actually received a warning before the water arrived. Radio broadcasts were not much help either, since the flooding happened at night, hours after most stations had already gone off the air. Water broke through in the early morning hours, while most people were still asleep, giving almost no warning before it arrived. By the time the flooding finally went down, an estimated 1,836 people in the Netherlands had died. Roughly 70,000 more people had to leave their homes. About 9% of the country's farmland ended up underwater. Nearly 50,000 buildings were damaged, and around 10,000 of those had to be torn down completely or were simply washed away.
20 days after the flood, the Dutch government put together a committee made up mostly of engineers. Forming the committee that quickly showed how seriously the disaster was taken at the highest levels of government. Their job was to figure out how something like this could be stopped from happening again. What they came up with became known as the Delta Plan, and it was extremely ambitious. Instead of just patching and raising the old dikes, the plan called for shortening the entire Dutch coastline by roughly 700 kilometers. It also called for closing off most of the open river mouths in the southwest part of the country with large dams and barriers. This would turn hundreds of kilometers of exposed coast into a much shorter and much easier line to defend. The logic behind this was straightforward. Every kilometer of coastline needs its own dikes, monitoring, and maintenance. By closing off the open river mouths with dams, instead of leaving them as long stretches of vulnerable coast, engineers reduced the total length of coastline exposed directly to the sea. A shorter line of defense is easier to build strong enough, and easier to keep an eye on, than a very long one with many separate weak points. Construction started in the 1960s and continued for nearly 4 decades. The scale of the work is hard to fully picture. Engineers built dams, water gates, locks, storm barriers, and reinforced walls across the entire southwest Delta region. Together, this connected system became known as the Delta Works. The biggest single piece of it is called the Oosterscheldekering. It stretches 9 kilometers across the mouth of the Eastern Scheldt, a body of water in the province of Zeeland. It is built from concrete supports and movable steel gates, designed to hold back a storm surge severe enough to happen, based on statistics, only once every 4,000 years. The movable gates were an important design choice. An earlier plan had called for a solid dam across the same stretch of water, but that would have sealed off the Eastern Scheldt completely and turned it from a saltwater area into a freshwater lake, destroying the local fishing industry and the natural saltwater environment in the process. Engineers redesigned the barrier so the gates could stay open under normal conditions, letting tides and saltwater move through as they always had, and only closed during a genuine storm threat. When it was finally finished and opened in October 1986, Queen Beatrix said simply that Zeeland was now safe. It has since been named one of the 7 wonders of the modern world by the American Society of Civil Engineers. That same list also includes an earlier Dutch project called the Zuiderzee Works. That project dammed off a large inland sea called the Zuiderzee in 1932, turning it into a freshwater lake called the IJsselmeer. It also created new land in the process, including what is now the province of Flevoland. Even after the Oosterscheldekering was finished, one important gap remained. The Nieuwe Waterweg is the main shipping channel leading into the Port of Rotterdam, which was already the largest port in Europe at the time and still is today. This channel could not simply be dammed shut the way the other openings had been, because that would have blocked one of the busiest waterways on the continent. Rotterdam needed a barrier that could block a storm surge when necessary, while staying completely open to large cargo ships the rest of the time. Solving that problem turned out to be the final and most clever part of the entire Delta Works project.
The solution engineers landed on for Rotterdam is called the Maeslantkering. Once you understand how it actually works, it becomes one of the more satisfying pieces of engineering to picture in motion. Instead of a fixed dam, engineers built 2 enormous curved steel gates, each 210 meters long. That is roughly twice the height of the Dom Tower in Utrecht, one of the tallest church towers in the Netherlands, if it were placed on its side. Each gate is attached to the riverbank by a giant joint that allows it to swing, similar to a hinge on a door, though on a far larger scale. Each joint is 10 meters across and weighs 680 tons. This hinge design means the gates do not need to be lifted or carried into position by cranes or cables. Instead, they pivot from a fixed point on land and sweep across the water under their own motorized power, which makes the whole process more reliable during a storm, when weather conditions could make other methods difficult or dangerous. Under normal conditions, both gates sit tucked away in dry areas built into the riverbanks, completely out of the water. This leaves the entire 360-meter width of the waterway open for the roughly 300 ships that pass through it every single day. The entire system is watched around the clock by a computer program that continuously tracks weather forecasts, wind speed, wind direction, and expected water levels. When that system calculates that a storm surge is likely to push the water level in Rotterdam above 3 meters over normal, the barrier begins closing on its own, without waiting for a person to make the call. Ships are warned 4 hours ahead of time. 2 hours before closing, all traffic on the waterway comes to a full stop. This is a real cost to the port, since closing the barrier reportedly costs around 10 million euros a day in disrupted shipping. 30 minutes before the gates actually move, the areas holding them are flooded with water, and the 2 hollow steel gates begin to float. Motorized units then slowly swing both gates toward each other across the river. Once they meet in the middle, the gates are deliberately filled with water and allowed to sink down onto the riverbed. This seals the waterway shut using the weight of the gates themselves, rather than any clamp or lock. The whole structure contains roughly 12,000 tons of steel. It was built this heavy on purpose, so that it cannot be moved quickly or by accident, since a wall that size dropping suddenly into a river could send damaging waves straight into the city it is supposed to protect. The barrier took 6 years to build. It opened in May 1997 and cost roughly 450 million euros at the time, which is somewhere around 700 million euros in today's money. For the barrier's first 10 years in operation, it was never triggered by an actual storm. It was only tested once a year during a scheduled drill. That changed on the evening of November 8, 2007, when it closed automatically for a real storm surge for the first time. It closed again in January 2018 during Storm Eleanor. At that time, operators had deliberately lowered the automatic trigger level so the barrier's real response could be tested under real stormy conditions, rather than waiting for a surge to naturally reach the standard 3-meter mark. Then, on December 21, 2023, during a storm named Pia, the Maeslantkering closed automatically at its full 3-meter threshold. This was the first time it had ever triggered purely on its own at that exact standard. Several of the Deltaworks' other major storm barriers closed at the same time in response to the same storm. It worked exactly as designed, and most people outside the Netherlands never even heard about it, because nothing went wrong. The Netherlands is not safe from the sea because the danger went away. The danger is the same as it has always been, and arguably worse now, since rising sea levels mean the Maeslantkering is expected to need to close far more often in the coming decades than the roughly once-a-decade pace it was originally built around. What has changed is that an entire country built a connected, self-monitoring system of dikes, dams, movable barriers, and drainage networks, specifically so that this threat does not have to become a headline again. It helps to compare the two moments directly. In 1953, the entire warning system for a deadly storm surge came down to 30 Telegram subscribers and a single waterboard that happened to receive the message in time. Today, a computer system tracks the weather non-stop and starts closing a 12,000-ton steel barrier on its own, hours before a person would even need to make a decision.
It is also worth being clear that this is not a finished problem sitting quietly in the past. A second Delta Committee was formed in 2008, specifically to study whether the infrastructure built after 1953 would still be enough as climate change speeds up sea level rise. Its findings have continued to shape new investment and reinforcement work in the years since. The stakes involved are genuinely large. Researchers at the Institution of Civil Engineers estimate that the South Holland coastal region alone, just one part of the country's flood-prone area, is home to approximately 4 million people currently living below normal sea level. North Sea storms in this region typically give very little warning time, and large-scale evacuation is not realistic, given how many people would need to move and how flat and open the surrounding land is. The Dutch approach to flood defense is not a monument built once and left alone. It is a system that gets checked, funded again, and rebuilt on an ongoing basis, because the people running it understand that assuming the threat is over is exactly the moment it stops being managed properly. What makes this genuinely impressive is the sheer amount of steady, unglamorous work behind it. There is no single dramatic rescue in this story. It is a country that experienced the worst possible outcome once, in 1953, and then spent most of a century making sure it would never happen that way again. They went from windmill-powered polders to concrete and steel storm barriers, turning the fact that they live below the ocean from a serious danger into one of the most confidently managed facts about an entire nation. Millions of people wake up every morning below sea level and simply go about their day, because nearby, a computer system is watching the water. Dozens of gates and locks are ready to move, and generations of engineers made sure that ordinary mornings were allowed to stay ordinary. Like this video, subscribe for more, and drop a comment telling me what surprised you the most. See you in the next one.